Grace Okafor was 19 years old the night her stepmother stood over her with a cup of cold water and said the words that would follow her for years. No man will ever want you.
What did I tell
Look
you?
at you.
I'm sorry,
You will
Mama.
die in this house,
Look at me when I
useless.
speak.
Yes, Mama.
Grace didn't cry that night. She had learned a long time ago that crying only made Beatrice angrier. So she wiped the water from her face with the edge of her wrapper, picked up the plate she had been washing and finished it in silence, while her stepmother's laughter echoed from the parlor, where she sat watching African Magic with her legs stretched out on the center table Grace had polished that same morning. This is Lagos. Not the Lagos of billboards and rooftop parties you see on Instagram, but the real Lagos, the one with rusted zinc roofs in Ajegunle, the one where a girl can grow up in a 3-bedroom flat and still feel like a stranger in her own home. Grace lived in that kind of house, on Adisa Street, off Cemetery Road in Mushi. And if you've ever felt unwanted in a place that was supposed to be home, you already know exactly how her chest felt every single night before she closed her eyes. If this story is already pulling at something in you, stay with me because it gets better, and I promise by the end you'll understand why some people go through fire, not to be destroyed, but to be shaped. But first, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story like this one. Now, let's continue. Grace's mother, Florence, had passed away when Grace was only 7 years old. Florence had been a seamstress on Simpson Street, the kind of woman who hummed old hymns while she worked her sewing machine, the kind of woman whose customers became her friends. Grace still remembered her mother's laughter, the way it filled up small spaces, the way it made even a rented room in Yaba feel like a mansion. But grief doesn't wait for a child to grow up before it changes her whole life. 2 years after Florence passed, Grace's father, Michael Okafor, a quiet man who worked as an electrician, remarried. He married Beatrice Umosu, a widow with 2 children of her own, a boy named Kelvin and a girl named Precious, both a little older than Grace. At first, Beatrice pretended to be kind. She bought Grace a school bag, she plaited her hair for her first day in JSS 1. Neighbors on the street would say, Michael don marry better woman o. See how she dey take care of that girl, like her own. But kindness that is performed only lasts as long as there is an audience. The moment Michael's small electrical business began to struggle, the moment money became tight in that house, the mask started to slip. By the time Grace turned 14, the plating had stopped. The school bag had been replaced with a torn one Kelvin no longer wanted, and the meals grew smaller, always after Kelvin and Precious had eaten their fill. Michael saw some of it, not all of it. Beatrice was careful, the way people who mean harm are often careful, but enough of it to make him uncomfortable. Whenever he tried to raise it, Beatrice would cry, tell him he didn't trust her, remind him that she left her own family's house to come and manage his motherless child. And because Michael was a tired man, a man carrying the weight of failing business and mounting bills, he would sigh, apologize to his wife, and let the matter die. Grace understood, even as a child, that her father loved her. She could see it in the way he saved coins for her school project, the way he would sneak her extra gari when Beatrice wasn't looking, the way he called her Nkem, my own, when no one else was in the room. But love that cannot protect you still leaves you standing in the rain. Then, when Grace was 17, Michael Okafor passed away. It happened suddenly. A heart condition nobody knew he had, the kind that Lagos traffic and Lagos stress and Lagos struggle quietly build inside a man until one evening he simply doesn't wake up. Grace remembered standing at the burial ground in a tan cemetery, in a black dress 2 sizes too big, borrowed from a neighbor, watching the only shield she had against the world lowered into the ground. Beatrice cried the loudest that day. Grace noticed that. She noticed a lot of things even in her grief. After that day, everything changed. There was no more pretending. By 17, Grace had become the house help in her own father's home. She woke before 5 in the morning to sweep the compound before Beatrice's shopkeeper girl arrived to open the provision store downstairs. She cooked, she washed clothes for 4 people while wearing clothes that were fraying at the seams. She was withdrawn from her private school and enrolled in an overcrowded public school in the area because private school is a waste of money for a girl who will just end up marrying, Beatrice said within Grace's hearing, though she never said it to Grace's face. She never needed to. Precious and Kelvin still went to their private school. Grace never asked why. She already knew the answer. What hurt Grace most wasn't the work. Growing up in Lagos, most children learn to walk early. That part of life she could carry. What hurt was smaller than that and heavier too. It was the way Beatrice's eyes would sweep over her sometimes, almost bored, almost irritated, as if Grace's very presence was an inconvenience she hadn't finished complaining about. It was the way Precious would roll her eyes whenever Grace tried to join a conversation, the way Kelvin called her housemaid as a joke that wasn't really a joke. And then there were the words. Beatrice had a particular talent for finding the exact sentence that would sit in Grace's chest for days. No man will marry a girl like you with all this attitude. You better learn to manage because nobody outside will want you. Even your own father, if he sees how stubborn you've become, he will be ashamed.
Grace never fought back. Fighting back had a cost in that house, and she had learned early which battles were worth the bruises. Not the kind you get from blows, but the kind that come from being denied food for 2 days or being locked out on the balcony until midnight for talking back. So, Grace did what many girls in her position learned to do. She turned inward. She found her escape in books, borrowed from a small library 2 streets away, run by an old retired teacher named Mrs. Adegun, who let Grace sit for hours, reading for free, because she recognized something in the girl's quiet determination. Grace read everything: old novels, newspapers, business magazines Mrs. Adegun's late husband had left behind. She didn't know it then, but that library would become the seed of everything that followed. By 18, Grace had finished secondary school with results good enough to make any parent proud. Results Beatrice dismissed with a shrug, saying there was no money for university and that Grace should instead learn a trade, like hairdressing, since that is all a girl like you will amount to. Grace didn't argue. She simply nodded, went back to Mrs. Adegun's library that same evening, and asked a question that would change the direction of her life. "Ma, is there a way I can learn computer things, like the small shops that teach people how to use laptop and internet?" Mrs. Adegun looked at her for a long moment, the way an adult looks at a child who has just shown something rare. "There is a center in Yaba, small fee. I can help you with half of it if you can find the other half." Grace found the other half by doing something she had never done before. She began selling small things. Pure water in traffic on weekends, recharge cards to neighbors, anything that would put a few $100 in her pocket without Beatrice's knowledge, because if Beatrice knew Grace was making money, she would find a way to take it. It took Grace 9 months of quiet, careful saving, 9 months of sneaking out early on Saturdays under the excuse of going to help Mrs. Adegun arrange her library, 9 months of learning the basics of computer operations, typing, and eventually small graphic design skills on second-hand systems in a cramped Yaba computer center with peeling paint and unstable light. If you are the kind of person who has ever had to build something out of nothing, quietly, without anyone clapping for you, you already know this part of Grace's story is the part that matters most. Because sometimes, the real turning point in a person's life isn't the moment help arrives, it's the moment they decide to help themselves, even when nobody is watching. Keep that in mind as we continue. At 19, Grace got her first small job helping a boutique in Yaba manage its Instagram page and edit product photos. It paid little, almost nothing by Lagos standards, but it was hers. She hid the money in a small pouch sewn into the inside of her wrapper, a trick she had read in one of Mrs. Adegun's old novels. It was through this small boutique job that Grace's path crossed with Daniel Adeyemi. Daniel wasn't a prince in the way fairy tales describe, no crown, no palace with golden gates, but in Lagos and in his hometown of Ikire in Osun State, he was, in fact, royalty. His full name was Prince Daniel Oladapo Adeyemi, second son of the reigning Oba of Ikire. He had grown up between two worlds, the traditional compound of his father's palace during festive seasons, and Lagos, where he had lived most of his adult life after studying business abroad and returning to build his own logistics company from the ground up, refusing to simply live off his father's title. Daniel didn't carry himself like royalty on the streets of Lagos. He drove himself, wore simple clothes, and preferred quiet corners of the city to loud, flashy ones. He had come to the boutique that day only because his younger sister, visiting from London, insisted on shopping there before her flight back. While his sister tried on dresses, Daniel noticed a girl in the corner of the shop, hunched over a laptop with a cracked screen protector, carefully editing photos with a focus that seemed almost out of place in the noisy shop. Something about her concentration, the way her brow furrowed slightly, the way she didn't look up even when customers made noise around her, caught his attention.
Hi, sorry
"Excuse
to
me,"
interrupt.
he said.
Oh, no,
"Is
it's
it you
okay.
that manages
I
the
just
shop's
wanted to say
page?
hi.
The one with
Hi.
the sunset background for the ready-to-wear collection?" Grace looked up startled. "Yes, sir, that was me." "It's good work, simply," Daniel said. "Better than what most bigger brands are doing right now." Grace, unused to compliments, especially from strangers who looked like they belonged to a different tax bracket entirely, simply nodded and said, "Thank you, sir," before returning to her screen, careful not to overstay a moment that felt too good to trust. Daniel didn't push further that day, but something about the encounter stayed with him. Not because Grace was strikingly beautiful in the way Lagos society often celebrates, though she was pretty in a quiet, unassuming way, but because of the quality of her attention, the discipline in someone so young doing work that didn't yet reflect what she was clearly capable of. He returned to the boutique a week later, alone this time, and asked the shop owner, a woman named Auntie Rosaline, about the girl who managed their online page. "Ah, that's Grace, so. Very hardworking girl. Manages herself well, Sha. I don't know her full story, but I know she doesn't have it easy at home." That single sentence, "she doesn't have it easy at home," planted something in Daniel that he didn't fully understand yet. Over the following weeks, Daniel found small, respectful reasons to return to the boutique. He never made Grace feel cornered or uncomfortable. Years of watching how his own mother, the Olori, carried herself with quiet dignity had taught him the value of patience. He would simply greet her, ask small questions about her work, sometimes offer suggestions from his own experience running a growing business. Slowly, carefully, Grace began to open up. Not about her home life, not at first, but about her dreams. She told him about the computer center in Yaba, about wanting to one day have her own small digital agency, about Mrs. Adegun's library, and the books that had kept her company through the hardest years. She never once mentioned Beatrice. She never once mentioned that she went home most nights to harsh words and colder meals. Some pain, Grace had learnt, was easier carried in silence than spoken aloud, especially to someone whose life seemed to hold none of it. But Lagos is a small city dressed up like a big one, and secrets have a way of finding their way to the surface. It was Auntie Rosaline who eventually mentioned it gently, not as gossip but as concern. "That girl, she's too quiet about her home. I once sent someone to drop something at her house because she wasn't feeling well, and the person came back and told me things that touched my heart. Her stepmother treats her anyhow. The other children go to good school. She is the one hawking and doing house chores like slave, even at 19. Daniel said nothing that day, but something inside him settled with quiet resolve. Over the following weeks, he began to pay closer attention, not by prying, but by simply being present. He noticed the days Grace came to work looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with normal work stress. He noticed the small flinch when certain topics came close to home. He noticed how she always left work exactly on time, never staying a minute longer, as if being late would cost her more than a scolding. One evening, as the shop was closing, Daniel offered Grace a ride home. Not the first time he had offered, but the first time she was too exhausted to refuse. It was on that ride, sitting in comfortable silence as Lagos traffic inched forward under a darkening sky, that Grace finally broke. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry loudly or tell her whole story in one breath. She simply said, staring out of the window, "You know, my stepmother always tells me nobody will ever want me, that I should just manage my life quietly because no man will look my way." Daniel was quiet for a moment before he answered, his voice steady. "She's wrong.
"You don't know her," said Grace, a small, tired laugh escaping her. "No," I agreed, "but I know what I see. And what I see is a girl who built a skill from nothing, who has been kind to everyone in that shop, even when she had every reason not to be, who reads more books than half the graduates I employ. That's not a girl nobody will want. That's a girl people will regret not knowing sooner." Grace didn't respond. She simply looked away, afraid that if she said anything, the tears she had been holding back for years would finally fall. Word travels fast on a street like Adisa Street, and it wasn't long before Beatrice heard, through a mutual acquaintance who worked near the boutique, that big man they follow Grace waka. At first, Beatrice laughed it off, certain it was exaggeration. But when Daniel began to send his driver to pick Grace up for occasional visits to his office to help design materials for his logistics company, a job he formally offered her with proper pay, Beatrice's amusement turned into something closer to alarm. It wasn't concern for Grace's well-being. It was the sudden fear of losing control over something she had grown used to owning. The night Beatrice found out that the big man was in fact a prince from Ikiri, information that spread through gossip after Daniel's driver mentioned it to a neighbor, everything in that house changed again, but not in the way you might expect. Beatrice didn't apologize. People who spend years building cruelty rarely apologize when the winds shift. Instead, they try to rewrite the story. She began telling neighbors how she had trained Grace herself, how she always knew the girl had something special in her, how she had sacrificed to raise her well. She began treating Grace with a strange, sudden gentleness that no one who lived on that street long enough to know the truth fooled. Grace watched this transformation with a calm she surprised even herself with. She wasn't angry anymore, or rather the anger had settled into something quieter, something more like clarity. She understood now that Beatrice's cruelty had never really been about Grace's worth. It had been about Beatrice's own fear, her own insecurity, projected onto a child who couldn't fight back. When Daniel formally came to the house with his parents' blessing as tradition required, although not with the pomp of palace processions, because Daniel had insisted on keeping things simple, respectful of Grace's reality, Beatrice sat in her best clothes, smiling the widest smile the neighbors had ever seen on her face. Grace sat quietly beside her, watching the woman who once poured cold water on her face, now serving cold zobo to royal guests with trembling, eager hands. It would have been easy, so easy for Grace to use that moment to humiliate Beatrice the way she herself had been humiliated for years. She had the power now, and everyone in that room, including Beatrice, seemed braced for it. Instead, Grace did something nobody expected. She stood, thanked everyone present, and turned directly to Beatrice. "Ma," she said, calm and clear, "thank you for the years you kept a roof over my head, even when things were difficult for all of us." The room went silent. Beatrice, caught between confusion and relief, simply nodded, unable to find words. Grace wasn't excusing what had happened. She would carry the memory of certain nights for the rest of her life. The cold water, the closed doors, the words that were designed to shrink her. But she had learned something important in the quiet hours of Mrs. Adigun's library, something that no amount of bitterness could give her, that carrying resentment forward would only tether her to the very house she was finally leaving. Grace chose instead to walk away lighter. The wedding, when it eventually happened months later, was not the grand palace affair so many Kiri expected of their prince. Daniel and Grace chose something smaller, held partly in Lagos and partly in Ikire, blending both worlds Grace now belonged to. Mrs. Adigun sat in the front row, dressed in her best lace, tears rolling freely down her face as she watched the quiet girl she had let read for free in her small library walk down an aisle towards a life that once seemed impossible. Auntie Rosaline was there too, telling anyone who would listen how she always knew Grace was destined for something bigger, a claim that made Grace smile privately, remembering the long hours she had spent hunched over a cracked laptop screen with no one watching. Kelvin and Precious attended, subdued in a way Grace had never seen them before. Beatrice sat close to the front in a new outfit clearly purchased for the occasion, smiling for photographs, accepting congratulations from people who didn't know the full story. Grace never publicly exposed her stepmother. She never used interviews or social media once her life became slightly more visible because of Daniel's family name to tell the world what had happened behind the walls of that small flat on Adisa Street. Some viewers of this story might feel that Grace should have, that justice demanded exposure. But Grace understood something many of us take years to learn, that the most powerful response to those who try to convince you of your worthlessness is not to prove them wrong through revenge, but to simply become undeniably, quietly, powerfully yourself. Today, Grace runs her own digital agency, the very dream she once whispered about in a cramped Yaba computer center, now grown into a company that trains other young girls from difficult backgrounds in digital skills, free of charge, the same way Mrs. Adegun once let her read for free. She calls it the Nkem Foundation, using the very word her father called her in whispered moments of love, the one soft thing that survived all those hard years. She still visits Adisa Street occasionally, not out of obligation, but because certain wounds once healed properly no longer need to be avoided. She helps when she can, quietly, without announcement, understanding that even Beatrice, for all her cruelty, was a woman shaped by her own struggles, her own fears about a world that often makes women feel disposable if they cannot secure themselves through marriage or wealth. Understanding her stepmother didn't excuse her. It simply meant Grace no longer needed to carry her as a burden. Grace often tells the young girls in her program one simple thing whenever she notices that familiar shrinking look in their eyes, the one she used to see in her own reflection. Somebody's cruel words about your future are not prophecy. They're just words spoken by someone who couldn't see far enough. Keep building quietly, even when no one is clapping. The right eyes will find you exactly when you're ready to be found. If Grace's story touched something in you today, do me a favor, hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel so you never miss stories like hers. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that the voice telling them they're not enough doesn't get to write the ending of their story. Drop a comment below and let me know. Have you ever had to prove someone wrong about your own worth? I'd love to hear your story too. See you in the next one.